Hello and welcome to all the Hillians out there. I'm Joe, here with me is my co-host Dan.
Hello and greetings.
And today we've got another Tears of the Kingdom video because people apparently like watching these more than anything else. But that said, we needed a few weeks break because Tears of the Kingdom had left a bad taste in one's mouth. I ended up discovering Bread Pirate's video of why Zelda shouldn't be sci-fi and should be fantasy. And he espoused a lot of the ideas and views we kind of had regarding Tears of the Kingdom, except he expressed them about the Breath of the Wild. And I got to talking with him a little on Twitter, pretty much agreed with me about Tears of the Kingdom, and was very encouraging, so I decided, rather than shy away from any further Tears of the Kingdom content, and after talking with another friend who said, yeah, this was sci-fi, I figured, yeah, we should definitely just make this video. Just further extrapolate upon why Tears of the Kingdom was left such a sour taste in our mouths. And it's not just some of the nonsense that you see and how the story doesn't actually work, but Zelda was originally created as a medieval fantasy universe. Originally, Link was just some elf boy running around chopping stuff up and going to save a princess. It was a very simple game. It's not till Link to the Past that we started to see the lore introduced and we started to see a universe taking shape. It's not until Ocarina of Time that it became even more well established. But the thing about A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time, arguably the two greatest games in the series, and the two that shaped the entire franchise, is that they were medieval fantasy stories. You look at a single level of Ocarina of Time, there is a lot of lore surrounding it. Ocarina of Time is fantasy fiction par excellence. And you look at A Link to the Past, just the first prologue, a ton of lore behind it and characterization that lies there beneath the surface. Check out our Hyrule in Focus series and you'll see what we mean. The problem is Tears of the Kingdom is a game that is ashamed to be medieval fantasy. It doesn't want to be associated with it. So it's not medieval fantasy. They have gone in a different direction and turned it into sci-fi. It doesn't even have the veneer of fantasy. And I think the problem I have with that is that it's taking Zelda in a direction it should never have gone into. And the thing is, it's Breath of the Wild that started this. And this is why part of me did have a bit of a problem with Breath of the Wild. But Breath of the Wild at least had the tribal story stuff going on, and it did have some interesting ideas with that. And the landscape was great and whatnot. So Breath of the Wild at least did have some fantasy to it. When it was fantasy, it did it well. When it was sci-fi, it didn't do it very well. Tears of the Kingdom learned all the wrong lessons in terms of literature and decided we're not going to be fantasy at all. We're just going to be sci-fi. And we're not even going to be very good sci-fi at that. This is where it just gets irritating because a lot of people prefer Tears of the Kingdom. That's fine. But the reality is that science fiction is not what this channel is about, is not what Zelda's about. And yet this weird monstrosity that has the name Zelda slapped on it, and that's really a science fiction story. And I hope people don't mind me calling it monstrosity, but it is just frustrating. And while I do think Zelda was in a bit of a rut and needing to expand and raise the stakes on all three of the timelines, just simply deciding to go, we're science fiction now, that doesn't solve the problem. Actually, that evokes a larger problem. And this game is geared at science fiction fans, not fantasy fans. It is a science fiction story with great leaps of logic, and where Link is essentially shafted and set aside running errands while Zelda gets the more important storyline. It has all sorts of time travel nonsense and whatnot. Ocarina had time travel, but it was just 7 years. This is across centuries and millennia. It is annoying, and it doesn't work.
The writers don't want to be writing Legend of Zelda. They wanted to be on the Legend of Zelda project, but they did not want to write Zelda.
Now, in terms of game mechanics, using the Schwartz to link two objects together and bond them together and create a new object like a motorcycle or a car or a boat or something, this has no place in Zelda. What the heck is this even doing here? This should never have been brought in. I will go that far. So in that regard, I can't help but think this is a terrible gameplay idea for Zelda. It could work in, I don't know, a Spaceballs game or any kind of sci-fi story game, except maybe to an extent Star Wars, which at least had a different kind of science fiction stuff. Actually, if they had made a reboot game, this would have worked better. If you had played as Bob or as Matrix, where you'd go, glitch, link this to that, and it happens because this is how glitch works in reboot. It would be fine. It would be great. I'd even say, yes, this is one of the greatest games of all time. Yes, finally reboot makes a comeback, except you get to play as Bob or Matrix. That'd be awesome, but that'd be science fiction. Or if you played as Hot Rod or / Rodimus Prime, and you had to use whatever tools that he's got to do similar feats, that'd be fun. Even if you played in Beast Wars as Cheetor or Rat Trap, or Rhinox or Optimus Primal, and you got to do this, that'd be fine. But the thing is, Link should not be compared to these characters. He is not even in the same genre. You should be comparing him to Dragonlance characters, or Warcraft, or even to an extent Mario and other Nintendo characters, but not across two opposite genres. Sci-fi and fantasy stand as opposites. Fantasy is modern equivalent of medieval literature. Sci-fi is talking about the future. It's what ifs that might lie down the road. So in this regard, one is about the past, or a mythological past. The other is about a mythological future. They are total opposites. So trying to turn them in or equate them with each other is dumb. It doesn't work. I think the main thing is that I'm not much of a sci-fi guy. As a writer, I don't write any sci-fi. I'm not very good at it. I prefer fantasy. I prefer mythology. Those other genres I typically write in, and some mystery as well, because I really like murder mystery. And I even write a bit of horror. That's fun. Dan, you primarily write these days in murder mystery, the political fantasy, intrigue, fantasy fiction. Your political intrigue story is linked to fantasy. We both write fantasy. It's just you write darker fantasy. I write all over the board. And you also have a great murder mystery story you're planning. But here's the thing. Neither of us are really sci-fi guys. We might watch the odd Star Wars or Transformers movie. I say Transformers movie, but 1986. We're not really built for science fiction. That's the thing. Looking at Zelda in the past few years turned from a fantasy story into this weird science fiction story that's aping fantasy fiction has been a thoroughly disappointing experience.
I may be the one more into science fiction than the two of us. Thinking of Zelda as science fiction.
And there's also the fact that you've got the droid arm stuck to Link. Come on, let's call it what it is. They basically took the idea from Luke Skywalker and Anakin Skywalker, getting a mechanical arm. Except Star Wars did it better, and it works in Star Wars. They're also probably thinking of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood / the manga, where that is a steampunk fantasy story. And that's a completely different beast. And that is actually a great story. But it's still not pure fantasy. Fantasy at its core is more medieval literature. Zelda is no longer conforming to that genre. This is why we're kind of frustrated and flabbergasted and just generally not receiving Tears of the Kingdom well. And when we look at the gameplay, it is so bizarre. It's one thing for Mario to go down this road. Mario is not a game series to be taken too seriously. It's just there to have fun with. It's a bit more casual in some ways. But Zelda, the minute they devised this weird three-way time with all the different games they built, like Majora's Mask, and by having later games, 3 different timelines reference earlier points in the timeline, it did turn it into a serious fantasy series. But now they've dropped it, saying, you know what, this fantasy thing, we don't really like it. We want our mainstream sci-fi story. At that point, I don't think this stands as a continuation of the old, but as something new. That's what Breath of the Wild somewhat was. And Tears of the Kingdom is even more of that. It's just disappointing, and it's a good drop-off point. Because in the future, they're just going to be even more science fiction. There were other roads they could have and should have taken, in my opinion. But by turning this into science fiction, they've essentially subverted Zelda. And I think that's the right word to use here. And people will probably be offended with us. And you know what? That's fine if you're irritated with us. The thing is that we don't want our videos to just be a simple, safe thing. We want to actually challenge not only yourselves, but ourselves intellectually, and actually present interesting videos with different point of views and actually have good debates and discussions. The trouble is with Tears of the Kingdom is that there's not as much to analyze. It's just not as intelligent a game, arguably, as earlier iterations, because it represents a intellectual decline in the series, and a decline in the literature of Zelda, and a decline in the game mechanisms. as the earlier games were more challenging, and thus, because they were harder, they were better for you. Things that come easy are not as worthwhile or as healthy as things that are harder in life. It's only through struggle that you grow. And I think that that's also them doing silly things like, oh, we're going to have flying mechanics. Link can fly. He can't die from jumping off a cliff like he could in Ocarina of Time. That's them causing and infantilizing their audience, saying, oh, well, you're not smart enough, or obviously you need us to cushion you. We don't want you to have this thing called a game over screen. So there's also that I have a problem with. No. Give it to them straight. They game over. You fall off a cliff, realistically, you pass. Stick to your guns, Nintendo. That's my argument. I just think that if they want a sci-fi thing, maybe the guys who made this game should have been on Metroid.
Send them off to Star Ocean. Send them off to make a Tales game. These are elements where, yeah, you have science fiction stories, but there's fantasy elements in there.
Like, given how good Tales of can get in terms of the story, I don't think they have the talent for Tales of.
Yeah, it was a rough example, but
I think the Tales of staff would be too smart. And if you're going to harshly disagree, that's fine. Just bear in mind, this is essentially here for entertainment and to challenge your thinking and to also get the creative juices and mental juices flowing. That is the sole purpose of Hyrule in Focus, is to provide a bit of a scholarly approach to Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. And we're kind of hoping to, once we're done doing the entire walkthrough of Link to the Past, jumping over to Ocarina of Time, and then going to analyze the characters of Link to the Past. And when we're done with those two, we'll be analyzing Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess, because that sounds awesome. If you enjoyed this video, and even if you didn't, do feel free to smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were Link taking down Ganon for the final time.